Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Michael Raynor. Michael is the Managing Director at the Deloitte US Strategy Group, and he's author of many books on the subject of innovation, many of whom you've probably heard of, including The Innovator Solution, written with the late, great Professor Clayton Christensen. Michael, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So for people who might not be aware of you and your work, can you give us a very brief background as to where you started and how you got to where you are now around innovation?
Sure. I did my DBA, my doctorate at the Harvard Business School back in the late '90s, and that's where I met Clayton. He was on faculty then. I didn't do my thesis with him, but that's when I met up with him and we collaborated on a couple of projects. I began work at Deloitte in 2000, and Clayton asked me in 2002 to collaborate with him on the Innovator Solution, and that kind of pushed the snowball off the mountain. So I've spent the subsequent 17 years in one form or another learning about and thinking about and trying to apply the principles that I was introduced to then.
Now, I know that the Innovator Solution, it was quite groundbreaking at the time when it came out, but the fundamental concept of separating out innovation teams so that they're not necessarily burdened by some of the bureaucracy in the core organization has gotten a bit of flack in recent years. What's your view on how the concept started out, what the theory behind it was, and how it holds true in today's world?
Sure. Well, I always reserve the right to learn. So to the extent that we understand more deeply whatever the limitations and constraints are on a particular idea, the circumstances in which it is more or less applicable, and things we come to understand about how to apply it more effectively, always room for all of that. I think the core guidance that emerged out of the Innovator Solution, in my experience at least, remains largely true because the underlying organizational pathology that we're addressing still obtains, right? With the premise in the Innovator, the observation in the Innovator Solution rather, is that companies attempting to pursue both sustaining and disruptive innovation simultaneously are subject to an unavoidable conflict between the financial measures that actually drive behavior. And so an effective, I won't say the only effective, but an effective way to manage that conflict is to create separate organizational entities that answer to these very different financial imperatives. That's a little different from saying the way to create innovation is put all the crazies in a room with beanbag chairs and whiteboards and tell them to go nuts. So sometimes, as ever, with ideas that gain a good deal of visibility, they end up taking on a bit of a life of their own and end up not looking like what you started out advocating for. At some level, at the risk of sounding flip, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Provided that we remember that a separate innovation group is hardly a comprehensive prescription for how to go about it. It's rather a high-level directive that is connected very directly to, as I mentioned, an underlying and unavoidable conflict between sustaining and disruptive innovation initiatives.
And you mentioned the difference between sustaining and disrupting innovation. I know disruption was really one of the favored words, especially around tech companies in Silicon Valley, and a lot of companies don't really understand what disruption actually means. Now, I know you've done some work with Clayton Christensen around this as well. Could you just give us a brief sort of insight as to what disruption actually is?
Yeah, well, it's actually is. It's I would say that it's important to distinguish between kind of the dictionary definition of of the word disruption and the very precise and technical meaning that Clayton intended when he adopted that term. So disruption is a well-formed English word. You can look it up in Merriam's or the OED or whichever your preferred English language dictionary might be. And it's basically something along the lines of introducing chaos and disorder to a well-established system, right? So disruption, in a sense, tends to have negative connotations in colloquial usage. And that gets used a lot. I mean, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the catastrophic consequences that are attendant to that. That certainly has disrupted daily life for pretty much everybody, right? And that's not a good thing. When Clayton adopted the term in the context of innovation and talked about disruption, he was describing a relatively narrow, and when I say relatively, I mean relative to how the term got applied in business contexts, a relatively narrow construct. And he was saying that a disruptive pathway, a disruptive innovation, is one that starts out as an inferior solution to problems faced by an economically unattractive segment of a market. And then from there, it gets better over time and ultimately comes to dominate the mainstream. So it's disruptive in the sense that it introduces chaos to an established order, but it's not merely that. It introduces a new order, right? And it's as a consequence of that it realizes the change that disruptive innovations typically realize. So that's pretty narrow, right? And disruptive innovation is not anything that succeeds. That's actually kind of useless. If it's defined by its outcome, it doesn't help you much. Instead, it describes a very particular pathway that organizations might follow from introduction to widespread adoption and success.
I think one of the things that a lot of companies got wrong is something that I'm keen to speak with you about, seeing as you're an expert on strategy as well. A lot of companies seem to think that using disruption as a strategy would yield the results that they saw in Silicon Valley, and therefore all you need to do is be disruptive and you'll be successful. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I hope folks don't do that. It may look like that from the outside, but my hope is that nobody's thinking. At least I shouldn't think anybody serious isn't thinking that. Well, they had that for breakfast, so I should have that for breakfast too, and that'll make me successful. I mean, they sort of look at this kind of caricature almost of, well, I'm going to be disruptive. I hope that's not as pervasive as some have suggested. I think where folks kind of get confused is perhaps adopting the disruption nomenclature as a way to kind of sell the idea. And then after a while, they forget when they were marketing and when they were actually building a market strategy. So, disruption as a strategy, it runs into the problems associated with not having a clear and consistent understanding of the difference between innovation and strategy specifically. And then that in turn, once you make that distinction, gives you a way to think about disruption as a particular way to innovate. And so that sort of conceptual ordering of the furniture, if you will, I think can be very helpful in avoiding the kind of entanglements that you're pointing to.
So what is, at a fundamental level, the difference between innovation strategy and innovation strategy? What's your view on it?
Yeah, so I mean, I won't claim to be the Samuel Johnson of the business lexicon here, but what I have found helpful, at least in organizing my own thinking and to some extent the clients that I've had the privilege to work with over the years, is that strategy and innovation can be usefully separated, but kept very closely connected, which they are. If we think about strategy really as a cross-sectional game and innovation as a longitudinal game, let me explain what I mean by that. Strategy, in my view, is a set of integrated choices. It essentially is it's the combined effect of how an organization embraces the trade-offs that define the services it delivers to its customers. Try and give a specific example here. It may have been a while since folks have stayed in one, but people remember hotels, I'm sure. And hotels are a very good example because there are a lot of elements to those business models that have resisted technology-driven change, right? So you've got hotels that are relatively cheap and cheerful, right? So they're located at the off-ramps to highways. They have no in-room service. They have relatively bare bones rooms, and they don't cost very much as a result. Then there are very expensive downtown hotels with in-room service and all kinds of white glove treatments, and they're much more expensive. And for obvious reasons, right? Because there are trade-offs associated with purchasing real estate, hiring and training staff, et cetera, right? So those trade-offs define, if you will, strategic positions within that marketplace, right? It's another way really of thinking about why there are segments in a market, right? So a down market hotel at $69 a night and an upmarket hotel at $800 a night, it doesn't make sense to say which one's better. They're just very different because they embrace very different trade-offs. So that's a way to think about strategy. Innovation is the complementary idea that beyond simply embracing trade-offs to be different, you can break trade-offs to be better. And so you can look at an organization like Airbnb as a company that has broken some of the core trade-offs at the heart of the hotel industry, right? So all of a sudden, if you want 650 square feet in Midtown Manhattan, you used to have to pay $800 a night at a hotel. Now you can get it for $250 on Airbnb, right? So they have broken that core constraint. Haven't broken all of them, right? Airbnb doesn't get your suit pressed at 3 a.m, so there are still limits, constraints that have not been broken. But certainly they've broken some, and so that, in my view, qualifies them as an innovation. So thinking very clearly about where you are embracing trade-offs to be different from your competition and where you are breaking trade-offs to be better than your competition allows you to think much more clearly about where and how you need to focus your effort in order to be successful.
What do you think companies get wrong when they're first trying to really set a clear strategy? Is it around making the right choices, or is it also around understanding what choices you're therefore not making?
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. And I certainly wouldn't be the first to observe that strategy is about what you don't do as much as it is about what you do. And in fact, going all the way back to the 80s, I guess, Michael Porter made the observation that a lot of companies get into trouble when they seek growth, because in pursuing growth, they end up losing their grip on the very trade-offs that made them so successfully in their initial stages. So a lot of companies find what I would call a niche in a market, in a market segment, where they are very carefully, maybe sometimes even without fully realizing everything that goes into it, but they end up threading a needle, right? And putting together a combination of activities that embrace a set of trade-offs in a way that allows them to serve a very specific segment of the market better than anybody else. And so they enjoy the fruits of that largely in terms of profitability. And so they grow to the limits of that niche, and they do so profitably because they have a unique solution. And then they look around and think, that's pretty cool. I'd like to do more of this. And so they try and grow into a larger market that goes beyond that niche. And so they find, in order to respond to the needs of these new customers, they have to start tweaking their model. And so now all of a sudden they start polluting the purity of the choices that they had initially made. And in so doing, they end up sacrificing the very differentiation that made them so profitable in their initial niche. And so you can probably tell the rest of that story, right? They end up now, over time, becoming ever more anodyne, ever less differentiated, and going from a profitable and stable company, they end up neither growing nor being profitable, and it all ends in tears. And that is a consequence of, in my view, not deeply understanding the ingredients of your existing strategy, nor understanding the critical importance of innovation when it comes to growing beyond that initial niche.
It sounds like when you're trying to grow into that new niche, you're effectively changing the core business. You described a couple of ways that happens, and you sort of lose focus on what made you successful previously. And bringing it back full circle then, is that one of the reasons why you suggested the innovative solution is to try out new things separate from the core business first, to see what it takes to make them successful before then being able to implement it back into the core business when they're ready.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, one of the if you'll forgive a semi-shameless plug, I had a book in 2000 called The Strategy Paradox, which talked about these options that companies can take. And so you think of them as real options, right? They're options in the real economy as opposed to the financial economy. And so these new divisions may in fact be options on either new growth, which is to say, if you have a core business and you set up a new division that has the remit of pursuing a disruptive path, well, then that's a growth option, right? If, on the other hand, it's a strategic option, which is to say you want to develop new capabilities that you may ultimately fold back into the core business, well, that's a whole different playbook in my view. And again, understanding at least going into that what your intent is can be critically important when deciding when and how to proceed as circumstances change.
Coming back to this concept of innovation strategy specifically, I'm still struggling anywhere in the market, including at my time at Deloitte, to find a really clear way of setting what could be described as an innovation strategy to then help the rest of the company understand what are the targets and what are the choices that the company is making in which direction to innovate.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Well, again, I won't claim to have the answer, but here's an answer that has worked for me at least. And it has to do, I'll go back to the relationship between strategy and innovation briefly. Within the universe of innovation, I tend to think of three paths that a company can take from its initial position in a market, where it will almost necessarily be somewhat small and marginal, right? Very rarely does a big thing start big. Typically, big things start small and they get bigger. And so the question that I think is helpful to answer is, when you enter the market, where are you in that market with respect to the mainstream along two dimensions, right? And it's price and performance. Because there's very often a trade-off between those two, right? The price that you can charge is often a function of the performance that you're able to deliver to a market. And so you may look at a given market and say, there's the mainstream of that market that I want ultimately to be a major player in, maybe even dominate. But I can't do that all at once, right? I don't have that answer, right? So how do I get there? Well, how you get there is a function of where you start. So I think of three innovation paths that one can follow. We've mentioned briefly disruption, right? So disruption is a particular path you can follow. It means starting with a niche in that marketplace that is defined by an inferior solution that appeals to a small segment of that market. So I think of that as a solution that has probably got the right price profile, but the wrong performance profile. It's not good enough. So think of Netflix back in the mid-90s. So Netflix started out as a mail order DVD business. So it was cheaper than Blockbuster at the time, but not nearly as convenient, right? You had to wait 3 to 5 days to get a new movie. So it imposed certain trade-offs on you in exchange for a lower price. So the right price, the wrong performance. That's a low-end foothold. A high-end foothold would be something like Tesla, right? Tesla had, when it entered the market, had very expensive cars, but very high performance cars. So they were starting at the high end. So their performance was great, but the price was too high. And then you could look at something like Uber. Uber started out with a performance that was arguably superior to the established taxi cabs, 10, 12 years ago, and a price that was also highly attractive. So it had the right performance and the right price. It just needed to grow. Now, those three different starting points imply three very different innovation pathways. Netflix had to figure out how to improve its performance without sacrificing its price. So those were the trade-offs they had to focus on breaking. Tesla had to figure out how to reduce its price without compromising its performance. So it had to figure out how to break cost trade-offs. And then Uber had both the price and the performance. It had to figure out how to train its consumers to behave differently when it came to using their service. So when you understand both where you are in the market and where you're headed over time, it allows you to focus your innovation efforts. That is to say, focus on those trade-offs that if you broke them, it would result in a larger number of consumers in the market you are targeting to actually adopt your service.
Fascinating insights. Michael, it's been a while since I've been at Deloitte. What's happening back at the mothership? I know that you're involved in some pretty interesting work there at the moment now as well.
Yeah, well, I think the technical term for my tenure at Deloitte is forever. So I did a couple of years when I finished my MBA in the mid '90s in the Toronto office. I went, as I mentioned at the outset, I went back to Harvard, finished and did my DBA, and rejoined the firm in 2000, and have been there ever since. So you add it all up, and it's a 22-year tenure at the firm. And I've had the privilege of working in a bunch of different spots in the firm, doing a variety of things. I've been involved in research. We've talked about a good deal of that. I've done a fair bit of client work. But quite recently, as I probably started de facto back in late October, early November, working on the firm's climate change strategy. So I'm now in the office of the Chief Strategy Officer, working with a small team, focused on how we both reduce Deloitte US's carbon footprint, and also how we get involved in some larger, what we refer to in the argot as ecosystem level plays. So that is to say, how do we actually involve ourselves in existing efforts in ways that really amplify and accelerate a lot of the good work that many other organizations are already driving. It's a broad-based effort, not just in the U.S. firm, but also around Deloitte globally, to really take seriously the fact that all organizations have a responsibility to be at least very deliberate and conscious about what their carbon footprint is. Deloitte's a very large and successful organization that takes that responsibility really very seriously. And so I'm excited, and to no small degree, it sounds a bit saccharine, but I'll say it anyway. Proud as proud as I've ever been to be part of Deloitte, seeing what the firm is, what the firm has its sights set on, and what we hope to accomplish.
Has it been interesting over the past couple of weeks and months seeing the ability of the world to work in a different way that actually reduces the climate impact?
Yeah, it has. Obviously, well, if it went without saying, I wouldn't say it, but it's worth reminding ourselves, obviously, that the real impact of the pandemic falls on thousands, indeed millions of folks who have fallen ill, many of whom have lost their lives, and the people who have putting themselves in harm's way to try and put society back on its feet. So that first thoughts always in that direction. At the same time, as the expression goes, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so to see organizations in general, and Deloitte in particular, pivot to a footing where things that we thought were absolutely inviolable assumptions about how we did our work turned out not only not to have been true, but to have been manifestly unnecessary, has been really astonishing. And there are deliberate conversations in Deloitte to think very carefully about how we take advantage of the fact that we've hit the reset button here on, in particular, how we travel, and more generally, how we collaborate and work both with each other and with our clients. So that rather than facing the challenge of how we do something like take travel out of our business or manage our travel more deliberately, we now have the very different opportunity of thinking very carefully and deliberately about how we add it back. And that's something, of course, that we never would have been able to have imposed on ourselves. And so back to my earlier observation, I'm quite pleased and proud to know that many of my colleagues are thinking very carefully about how that unfolds across not just Deloitte in the US, but around the world.
It's been absolutely lovely speaking with you today. I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. Michael, if people want to find out more about you, your work, your insights, what's the best place they can go?
Well, they can go to DeloitteInsights.com, which is a website, of course, that hosts all of Deloitte's thought leadership on a whole variety of topics. So there'll be, I'm a very small percentage of, my work's a very small percentage of what's there. So if you're looking for me in particular, just use the search bar. But alternatively, you'll have the opportunity to see what my colleagues at Deloitte have been up to, which is a great deal.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to get that link down in the description below. Michael, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
You bet. Thanks, Nick. Take care. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.